Well, thank you all for coming out. I'm Barry Posen. I'm the director of the Security Studies program at MIT. I can make no special claim to be an expert on Ukraine, but I have a lot of experience chairing panels. I don't know if many will attest to my skill at that, but I do have a lot of experience. I do have some strange connections to Ukraine. My grandfather came from Kiev, not under happy circumstances. 20 years ago, a friend of mine asked me to write a paper about whether or not Ukraine would be capable of defending itself against Russia. This topic was considered to be bizarre at that time, but I did in fact write the paper. And it was never published in English, but it was published in Russian, which is kind of odd. Anyway, I'm going to put that paper up at our website for those of you who may be interested in that question. And then third, I teach a course on U.S. military power where I teach people how to analyze military campaigns. And for years now, I've used as a model campaign the defense of Poland's eastern borders against a Renaissance Russia. And my theory about that was this was a paper topic that seemed sufficiently improbable that the students wouldn't want to use it as a paper topic, and therefore I could use it as exemplary material. So once again, strange connection to Ukraine. If you're here, you know why you're here. We're talking about a state that was once a sovereign republic, once a republic of the Soviet Union. It's had a kind of unhappy career since the Soviet Union came apart and it got its independence. An unhappy career in terms of its domestic politics, an unhappy career in terms of its economics. The most recent iteration of this, from my point of view, President Yanukovych was looking for outside help and was running the bidding process between the EU and the Russians that I think Ukraine has been doing for 20 years. The EU offer, I think, gave a lot of people in Ukraine hope that maybe things would finally break in a certain direction. Not everyone in Ukraine had that hope, but some clearly did. And Vladimir Putin, in his inimitable way, outbid the European Union, and Yanukovych swung the other way, and the hopes of these people for more connections to the West were obviously shattered. The ensuing large-scale protests brought the regime down, and for reasons which we can all guess at, and I'm sure the speakers can do more than guess at, the response to this series of events by Vladimir Putin and the state he leads, Russia, are as we see, the grabbing of the Crimea. Political events are in train in Crimea, which suggests that there's a very good probability it will leave Ukraine and be annexed by Russia. U.S. diplomacy is trying to do something about that. I personally don't have much hope. And of course, if you're reading the paper, there are military movements on Ukraine's border in regions opposite parts of Ukraine where there are significant Russian ethnic populations and Russian-speaking populations. And everyone is waiting, hoping that it doesn't happen, but waiting and worrying that the Russians may act again and what can be done to deter them. So I'm going to make a few remarks, not now, but at the end of the panel about how I see U.S. interests. I'm sure the other panelists will talk about that as well. I'm going to give you introductions in the order that they're going to appear, and this order was decided by Carol Saivetz, not by me. So, yeah, we're back in business. Okay, so let me go over the speakers. Our first speaker will be our colleague Oxana Shevel from our compatriot school, Tufts University. Her research and teaching focus is on the post-communist region, which includes Russia and the surrounding areas. She works on nation and state building, citizenship, migration, politics of memory, all the kind of juicy stuff that makes this area such a cauldron. Her recent book received an award from the Ukrainian Studies section, the American Association of Ukrainian Studies, and she has a new book project on a comparative study of citizenship politics in post-communist states. Second, Gene Fishel is division chief in the Office of Russian and Eurasian Analysis of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the Department of State. He's held a variety of other posts in the U.S. government, most of them having to do with Russia, the Ukraine, that region. He's lived in that part of the world. He's studied this for most of his career. He's a local guy, at least in terms of his education. He has a BA from UMass Lowell, an MA in IR from Boston University, and he's also studied at the Naval War College. And then our third speaker is Ambassador retired John Herbst. He's been the senior director of the Center for Complex Operations at the National Defense University since September 2010. He also lectures there on stability operations and peacekeeping. All kinds of strange things happen when I stand up. He was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine 2003 to 2006. In that capacity, he worked to enhance U.S.-Ukrainian relations, and also to ensure the conduct of a fair election. He's also, in the past, worked in Afghanistan and in other areas, other parts of the world, all parts of the world where the United States has interests. And finally, our own Carol Saivetz is here, and Carol's a research affiliate in the Security Studies program in the Center for International Studies here at MIT. She's also a lecturer in political science. She's a research associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian Studies. She's studied Russia for most of her career and has a PhD from Columbia University. And she's written widely on Soviet and Russian policy toward the Middle East. So that's the quick lineup. And I'm going to move quickly to our first speaker. So Oxana, I guess they want us to stand up to do this. So yeah, okay, good. What died?
I've been asked to talk about American policy to the crisis in Ukraine. So let's do that. The United States has been very quick to engage as the crisis developed. As you recall, the problem began in late November of last year when Mr. Yanukovych walked away from a negotiation with the EU regarding a trade agreement. There we go. And suddenly, tens of thousands of protesters were in the streets of Kyiv. His effort to sweep them off the streets with police force were unsuccessful because, by and large, police in Ukraine are unwilling to use force against peacefully demonstrating citizens. Something he should have learned from the Orange Revolution, but didn't. And the next day, he had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets who were protesting not so much against the European Union deal gone bad, but against increasingly authoritarian and increasingly corrupt leadership under Mr. Yanukovych. American policy was quick to denounce the use of violence against peacefully demonstrating citizens, and to demonstrate support, and to encourage Mr. Yanukovych to resolve his now large political problem via negotiations. To demonstrate our unhappiness with Mr. Yanukovych's heavy hand, there was an OSCE ministerial in Kyiv in December 10, and John Kerry was supposed to go there to show that he wanted to keep the government of Ukraine at arm's length. He did not go. He did send his Assistant Secretary, Victoria Nuland, who, in a demonstration of some support for people's right to protest against their leadership, she went to the Maidan, famous Independence Square in Kyiv, and handed out cookies. I don't know if she needed to do the cookies, but she was there to demonstrate that we believe that civil society has a right to disagree with its own government. And that's kind of how American policy stood for the next 4 or 5 weeks. Behind the right for democratic demonstrations, against the use of force against citizens, in favor of negotiations to resolve political crises. Standard State Department stuff. FSOs can write these talking points in their sleep, and often do. Things were ratcheted up in mid-January. Mr. Yanukovych had a problem because even though Mr. Putin was willing to give him $15 billion in loans and a lower price than gas, the demonstrators in the streets of Kyiv didn't care. And so his first effort to use force failed. What was he going to do now? He put through the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, a whole host of laws which essentially outlawed everything that the demonstrators and the opposition parties were doing. A major step towards the ideal police state that Mr. Yanukovych seems to want to have constructed. We reacted very strongly to that, and as someone who's involved in Ukrainian affairs, both from Washington and from the field for about 6 years, I can tell you by American standards this was near light speed. We reacted quickly to that because within a few days of this step in Kyiv, we announced visa sanctions against senior Ukrainians involved with the crackdown on demonstrators. This was an important step because there were no true believers in the Yanukovych government. No one was there to build a better vision of Ukraine as Mr. Yanukovych laid out. This was a group of our opportunists and thieves who were in the government to better their own personal circumstances. So when suddenly they're confronted with their inability to travel to the United States and the Damoclean sword of financial sanctions going after their assets, their attention was riveted. Unfortunately, this is a theme which we'll talk about a little bit later, even though I only have about 8 minutes left. Our sanctions, American sanctions, while useful, are not nearly as persuasive as European sanctions because most of the travel and most of the deluxe residences and most of the money are held in Europe, in Western Europe. Anyway, our policy from mid-January on, and I speak as an observer, not as a policymaker, our policy from mid-January on was to persuade the Europeans to do like us because their sanctions have more teeth than ours in Ukraine. So that's what we were doing. In any case, Mr. Yanukovych was not in power a successful authoritarian because, as I already mentioned, he did not have the tools of repression which all successful authoritarians require to repress their own people. So when you had this outcry within Ukraine, more demonstrators poured into the streets after those laws were passed through the Rada. When he saw that the would-be repression was not having the impact, he stepped back. And as he stepped back, our policy continued to be, yes, we're still sanctioning you guys, and we're still trying to persuade the Europeans to sanction you, but again, negotiations are the way to go. And in fact, in mid and late January, the deal which the EU cobbled together in late February would have solved the crisis. And we'll come to that in 2 short minutes or so. Okay, so this is our policy from mid-January up until the week of, I think it's February 17, the week of the sniper. Again, Yanukovych had people in the streets who were not going to be persuaded to come off the streets because of gifts from the Kremlin, who were not going to be persuaded to come off the streets because of the threat of police coming in. They already withstood several police efforts to sweep the Maidan. So what's the dictator going to do? Some genius came up with the idea that maybe we can sow panic in the streets if we begin shooting them. But again, he didn't have enough. I mean, he didn't want to just bring out guys with machine guns, because in that case, he could have made do with a couple of hundred. So he armed some members of Berkut, the special police units, the special operations police, with live fire, and they put snipers up on the roofs who began shooting people, by and large, indiscriminately. Although maybe not so indiscriminately, because the snipers take dead aim. The idea was if the demonstrators actually see people dying, they're going to leave. You don't need hundreds or actually thousands of police to move the tens of thousands of demonstrators off the streets. But once again, Mr. Yanukovych miscalculated. So, American policy in response. We're doing the same things we have been doing. We again begin talking more ominously about financial sanctions. Of course, we condemn the violence. Of course, Joe Biden gets on the phone with Mr. Yanukovych, and John Kerry gets on the phone with whoever he gets on the phone with. But the use of deadly force is decisive in Mr. Yanukovych's own downfall because it gets the Europeans, who are always slow to act, off the fence. And by the way, I forgot to mention the famous phone call. The famous phone call between Toria Nuland, our Assistant Secretary of State, and Jeff Pyatt, our ambassador in Kyiv. In that phone call, Toria and Jeff made a mistake talking on an open line. That was really dumb. Aside from that, what was said was unobjectionable. They were brainstorming about how the opposition should respond to the offer from Mr. Yanukovych for them to come into the government without any powers. And of course, those who claim it demonstrated Americans were manipulating their opposition marionettes didn't pay attention to the fact that Toria's preferred plan was not followed by the opposition. Okay. So, the week of the sniper happens, Europeans come in with financial sanctions, and the government falls. Which was going to happen because, again, it was a government of opportunists and thieves, not convinced authoritarians with the vision of Ukraine. Mr. Putin, for some reason, did not understand this was going to happen. And by the way, the Russians have regularly misunderstood Ukraine over the past decade and a half. Instead, he sends his troops into Crimea. Here, too, the American reaction by our standards was, I would say, pretty good. Not great, and I'll explain to how it could be better, but pretty good. Of course, we condemned it immediately as a violation of international law, Ukrainian sovereignty, and numerous Russian commitments. And of course, as a violation of the post-Soviet European order. We also announced very quickly visa sanctions and financial sanctions against senior officials in Russia involved in this great breach of international law. As with Ukraine, the visa sanctions came out pretty quickly, and the financial sanctions were held more like a sword to be used later. We talked to our European allies because, again, their sanctions will be much more effective than ours because all the big Russian money is in Europe. Very little. There's some here, but not nearly as much. We talk about we say straight off, we're not going to be in a shooting war with the Russians in defense of Ukrainian sovereignty. However, and this is an important however, what happens in Crimea and the possibility, what happens in Crimea and the possibility of further Russian action elsewhere in Ukraine is a matter of grave national security concern to our NATO allies, especially the Balts, and any country which borders Russia, like Poland. So we send 6 fighters to Poland. We talk about increased air patrols in the Baltic states. And of course, we're on the phone big time with the Russians. Obama with Putin. Kerry and Lavrov, they're on the phone, they met today. I think that not much happened in that, although we haven't had any major news reports, at least not before we began this session. And we keep saying to the Russians, well, if you're really concerned about ethnic Russians in Crimea, which of course is baloney, but I'm not going to talk about that, I don't have time. There are ways to deal with that. There are international monitors who go there and make sure that your precious ethnic Russians are not hurt. And again, we lobby with the Europeans. And if you watch the European reaction, it was very much the same vis-a-vis the Russians once the invasion of Crimea began, and vis-a-vis the Ukrainians when the violence began in the streets of Kyiv, which is a certain unwillingness to take the necessary measures that would have some teeth, that would have an impact in Russia. But if you've been following the news, you know that yesterday, finally, Merkel got off the fence. Just a few days before, she continued to say, oh, no, sanctions, we don't believe in sanctions. But yesterday, she made a very tough speech in Germany, which I'm sure caught Mr. Putin's attention. Because of it, she had, up until the point she made that speech, those unidentified Russian troops in Crimea were kicking out all international would-be observers. But suddenly the Russians saying, well, maybe the OSCE can go in to look at the referendum coming up on Sunday. I see I have 1 minute, and it's good because I'm just about done. What happens next? We still have in reserve financial sanctions against the Kremlin. Given what the Germans are now saying, I think it's quite likely you'll see serious financial sanctions against the Russians from Europe. You had a really interesting development yesterday, which we had something to do with, although I can offer you much speculative reasons for what's happening, but I can't tell you what's happening, so I don't know. There was the arrest in Austria of Dmytro Firtash, a major Ukrainian oligarch. And this arrest is perhaps the most he's perhaps the most intriguing guy we could have arrested at this point in time. Because not only is he important within a Ukrainian context, but he's also important in a Russian context. All of the graft which has benefited senior officials in Kyiv, senior officials in Moscow, including Mr. Putin, through the shadowy firm Rosukrenergo, which would siphon off profits from Gazprom sales to Ukraine and give it to privileged officials. This guy was the man doing it. So he could tell us some really interesting things about how Mr. Putin has become, according to Forbes, one of the wealthiest men in the world. And keep in mind that Mr. Yanukovych was completely discredited everywhere in Ukraine once people got into his dacha outside of Kyiv and began to see what he was doing with Ukrainian money that he had stolen. Thank you.
All right. Well, there are there are going to be no maps, which is too bad because there will have some good maps. I have to say over there. Okay. Right. Well, my notes actually are on the thing, but I'm gonna. Okay, never mind. So what I was going to talk about today, I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about domestic political context, both in Ukraine as a whole and in Crimea specifically. And the two main points I wanted to convey, first, that following the protests against Yanukovych, and now especially following the Russian aggression, there is actually more unity rather than less unity in Ukraine. And that's, I think, important to keep in mind because we do hear a lot in the media about Ukraine being a deeply divided country and, the Russian minorities in the southeast are perhaps, being kind of more pro-Russian and so forth. I think that's, there is definitely some truth to that, but the glass is much more half sort of full rather than half empty. So I was going to spend a little bit of time on that and show some maps, but I'm just going to talk through those points, right? And then shifting gear and talking about domestic politics in Crimea, a couple of things I wanted to mention. Obviously, it all may have no bearing on what Putin already decided to do, but if we actually look at the situation on the ground and sort of where the preferences are in Crimea based on the polls that we have, in fact, if referendum was free and fair, there is no guarantee, given the polls that we have, that in fact more than half would support Crimea joining Russia. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of domestic political context, how the Crimea has always been sort of a sore point and potential hotspot in Ukraine, but a political negotiated compromise between Crimean and Ukrainian elites was always found. And I think there are reasons to hope that if Russian forces ever got out of there, which may not happen, there is actually still a potential for negotiated settlement between Crimea and Ukraine. So let me expand a little bit on these points in a short time that I have. So as far as domestic divisions in Ukraine, right, it is true that of course there is this east-west difference, right? We can see it in electoral maps, we can see it in maps about ethnic and linguistic composition of the country. On the other hand, it's important to keep in mind that the border is first of all malleable and second of all has been shifting. Right, so where exactly this east-west divide lies is not at all obvious. It's very clear that, say, Donetsk in the east and Lviv in the west are very different as far as their preferences, say, for anything from cultural policies to geopolitical orientation. But there is this big territory in the middle, central Ukraine, where people have much more blurred, sort of beautified Ukrainian-Russian identity, where many people are undecided on a number of issues. And furthermore, if we look at the election results in Ukraine from early 90s through the most recent sets of elections, we can see how this border between East and West has been shifting west. Has been shifting east. In other words, the parties that campaigned and came to elections with a more, we can say, sort of pro-Western agenda or pro-Ukrainian agenda, in the early 90s, they were able to do well only in the westernmost regions, Galician region that became part of the Soviet Union after Second World War. Over the 20 years of Ukrainian independence, this border has shifted much more to the east, and now, central Ukraine is much more firmly in sort of the pro-Ukrainian camp, if you wish, than say it was in the early or mid-1990s. Now, and if we look at the opinions, the popular opinion within Ukraine on support for independence and territorial integrity, it is pretty solid all across Ukraine. So one of the more recent polls that we had seen on the question whether or not Ukrainian citizens support Ukraine and Russia becoming one state, there is a negative attitude to this question everywhere in Ukraine, including Crimea. So Crimea, not surprisingly, had the highest percent of people who actually favor unification into one state, and that's at 41%. Oh, okay, all right. Oh, well, I see. Mystery. Okay, let's see. How does this? Nothing happens when I press. Now the buttons don't work. Can you help me with which? Okay, so the okay. So right. So this is the map. You can see here shows support for in the last parliamentary elections for the Party of Regions and the Fatherland Party, and also shows the percent by ethnicity, right, of Ukrainians and Russians, and obviously. You can see Crimea is the only region in Ukraine where ethnic Russians are majority of the population, and they also obviously greater concentration of Russians in the east of the country. But again, as I was saying, this border, first of all, has been shifting, and second of all, sort of where exactly the border is not at all clear. And again, if we look at, say, support for succession, for joining with Russia, so in Crimea, it's 41%. In Donetsk and Luhansk, the second two regions with larger percent of Russian population, it was in the low 30s. And elsewhere in the southeast, it was anywhere from like low 20s to single digits, right? So again, even within this sort of, you can say, Russian-speaking Ukraine, there is quite a lot of variation in places like Kherson and Mykolaiv. It's literally single digits, right? And if we look again at the demonstrations that were held since Russians invaded, yes, there were definitely pro-Russian demonstrations, but also much larger, usually equally or larger demonstrations in these parts of the country, right? So again, I think if Putin did try to annex or invade eastern Ukraine, it would be much harder both to create the appropriate media picture of, say, local population welcoming it, and in fact, to kind of do it unobstructed, because I think it's pretty clear that the people there, that's not what they want. So again, here's some additional maps for the 2010 presidential election. So yes, there is clearly, this regional divide, not to be ignored, not to be sort of, taken lightly. But again, the picture is more complicated, and to assume that, everybody who voted for Yanukovych in 2010 or speaks Russian, holds certain views would be great oversimplification. Now, furthermore, this is another interesting, I think, slide, because here it shows more detail the map, the situation in Kharkiv Oblast, right, which is a Russian-speaking region. Here on the map, it's, I don't know how to show it, but it's, actually, you can actually see where it is, right? It's in the yellow part or blue part, right? But if we look inside the region, right, even within the Russian-speaking regions, oftentimes the Russian speakers would be concentrated in the urban centers. Here we have the city of Kharkiv, right, where majority population is Russian-speaking, but the countryside is still Ukrainian-speaking, right, even within the Russian-speaking region, which again kind of adds another layer of complexity, and I think important to keep in mind when we talk about regional and linguistic and ethnic divisions in Ukraine. So this is the poll that I was referring to. It's maybe a little bit hard to see, and it is not in English, but the support for joining, right, Russia by region, the highest in Crimea, 41%, 33% in Donetsk, right, and then it goes down right? And again, so even within the southeast in many regions. And that was before the Russian invasion. So I think there are good reasons to think that if similar poll was conducted now, the numbers would be smaller still, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, sort of what about the new government? Again, we hear in the press much, in the Russian press in particular, that the new government is not representative, that it is, supported only by half of the country. Again, that is not quite true. I mean, this is not to say the government cannot be more inclusive. I think there is definitely something to think about. Many advocates and scholars of Ukraine have been advocating for early parliamentary election, which would be a good way to increase the legitimacy of the government, not just presidential, but parliamentary. But again, if we look at these poll figures, we can see that the government does have, again, the new government majority support. And these are very recent polls from just last week. Right, support for Yanukovych, overthrow was 70%, right? And again, for Ukraine, these high 50s, it's very high support because people are very distrusting, and oftentimes some leaders of Ukraine, including those who held office, had single-digit support or like low teens. So the fact that it's a new government has 57% support is actually huge.
There is a crucial word there, partially.
Yes, but I mean, even if you add these up, right? So I mean, the options would be fully support, partially support, don't support, don't at all support, like mainly don't support. But if you compare that with any previous poll with exact same questions, right, you get quite different picture. So that's yes. So that so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so just one word I want to mention, about the far right before I move on to Crimea. It is true again, right? So that the Svoboda party is a far right party. You probably read and heard about a lot about Pravy Sector. Is this sort of detrimental danger to Ukraine? Again, I would say it shouldn't be underestimated, but also shouldn't be overestimated. The main one important thing I want to convey that again, if we look at the polls within Ukraine for support for these parties, Technobok, the leader of Svoboda, polls at something like 4 or 5%. The Svoboda party itself polls in less than 10%. They have less support now than they had in the last parliamentary election. So in fact, sort of the best remedy and the best antidote to potential influence and rise in the influence of the far right would be free and fair election in which these parties would get their, 8, 10% at most, perhaps less, and that would be that. So they would be, they would have some representation, right? And they're not going to be running the country, and it won't be, something to keep in mind, something to be aware of. There are some reasons for concern, but certainly to say that somehow the whole government is controlled by these far-right radicals is just simply not true. And furthermore, also interesting to keep in mind that many of the activists who now campaign actively and engage in violent acts in the east of the country on the pro-Russian platform, in particular the self-declared governor in Donetsk, who had recently been arrested, they've been members of the far-right, in fact, like neo-Nazi parties of the Russian, pro-Russian orientation. So kind of the danger of the far right or the extreme, whatever you want to call it, the fascists, right, actually comes, and given who perpetrates violence now, including yesterday in Donetsk, comes sort of from the pro-Russian side, right? So again, that doesn't mean that Ukrainian side is, not cause for concern, but again, the picture is more complex. Now, sort of moving on to Crimea, right? As we know, Crimea, as this map shows, is the only region of Ukraine with majority ethnic Russian population. According to the last census of 2001, it was about 58%. It may be less now. It's most certainly less now because another important demographic group in Crimea are the Crimean Tatars, the Sunni Muslim group that has been deported by Stalin in the 40s, have come back since the late Gorbachev period. They have been very strongly pro-Ukrainian. I'll mention a little bit more about it. And they have higher birth rates. So now sort of the estimates that we have, there hasn't been a recent census, but that they account probably for about 15% of the population overall and probably as high as 20% in the youngest age group, right? And as I said, that they are very much against Crimean annexation by Russia. They spoke against the referendum. They're a very mobilized group. Again, I don't have time to go in my remarks, but if anybody has questions and sort of wants to think what Tatars might do if Russia annexes Crimea, we can certainly think about it in the Q&A, right? Now, but even looking at the pro-Russian majority in Crimea, a couple of things that makes Crimea unique within Ukraine. So first of all, of different regions in Ukraine, Crimea is the one that has the strongest local identity, right? So this is a poll from May 2013 conducted by the Gallup and some other groups. Right, so again, when people are asked, right, how do you consider yourself, regardless of what your Soviet passport might say, Soviet passports recorded ethnicity, right, we can see that substantial number of population within Crimea identifies as Crimeans, right, as opposed to, say, Russians, Ukrainians, and that's quite different. Yesterday we had a round table at Harvard, and Professor Terry Martin had these graphs showing the really strong regional identity in Crimea, which is not the case elsewhere in Ukraine. Now, also interesting, I don't know how you can see that, but this compares how people self-identify given what their passport actually says. And you can see, again, for Crimean Tatars, have very strong identity, so essentially people who are Crimean Tatar by passport feel Crimean Tatar. But as far as Ukrainians and Russians, it's much more mixed picture, right? So passport Russians and passport Ukrainians don't overwhelmingly necessarily think of themselves as, Russians or Ukrainians. Substantial, wrapping up. Okay, so a couple of more things, from the polls here. Do Crimeans feel sort of discriminated? And here, the point I want to emphasize that it's not even clear that majority there would necessarily support joining Russia. This is a list of issues that Crimeans consider important, right? And you can see the status, for example, of Russian language. Only 4% in Crimea have been concerned about the status of language. Under the Crimean constitution, Russian has an official status, so even the cancellation of this law within central government, which is problematic for all sorts of reasons. Again, we can go more into Q&A. Not a great cause for concern, right? What should the future of Crimea be? According to this poll, right, as you can see, sort of 30 to, between 20 and 30%, in fact, only wanted Crimea to become part of Russia, and much larger percent of people wanted Crimea to remain within Ukraine, perhaps with greater autonomy. A different poll, I don't have a graph, shows that, again, 41% favoring Crimea to be, part of Russia, and about the same number wanting it to have greater rights, greater autonomy, but remain within Ukraine. So again, kind of putting referendum in context, right? And just to wrap up, some of the Russian polls, in Russia, in fact, more than half of the population does think Crimea should be, by right Russian, which is quite interesting, which is higher number than, say, for Dagestan and Chechnya, which are parts of Russia, right? So they feel Crimea is more Russian than these regions, right? This is the referendum. There has been lots of jokes, and I'm wrapping up. Let me just kind of add on the lighter note. Do you support, Crimea joining Russia? Yes, I support. No, I don't support. I support. So here, basically, essentially, whatever you answer, there is no way to say no. There is, for example, the ballot doesn't give you an option to say you don't support Crimea joining Russia or becoming independent. That's simply not an option. If you try to do that, your ballot will be invalid. Some of a friend of mine from Sevastopol sent me some of sort of the appeals. I'm not going to go over it, but I think this is quite telling, right? So this is how Crimean voters are presented with a choice, right? Either you have some sort of Nazi rule in Crimea, or you join Russia. Nice choices, right? Right, again, more of the propaganda. And so the final point, how Crimea, and that's, maybe we again address it in the Q&A, how Crimea is very heavily dependent on Ukraine for things such as gas and water and electricity and so forth, which would be very difficult, to ignore that if we're talking about practical steps of the region being removed from Ukraine and being under Russian rule. And I'll probably end here because, and that's Ukrainian-Russian military imbalance, but that's not, that's not news. Okay, so I'll end here.
That's why I wanted her to bring the slides and the map. What I thought I would do, since I work on Russia and not on Ukraine, is to talk about what I think is going on in Putin's head. Eugene talked about some of this, but I will pick it up a little bit. And I guess the question I have is Putin living in sort of a parallel universe, the way they used to say on Star Trek, or the way Angela Merkel said he's lost touch with reality? Or is it, in John Kerry's word, a 19th century move in a 21st century world? I think that, as Gene said, Putin's worldview is definitely to address the chip that he has on his shoulder since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that he wants to restore Russia's superpower status. And I think one of the questions that has really not been addressed in certainly the Western media coverage is whether this is even possible given the declining growth rate in Russian GDP and the problems within the Russian economy. About 15 years ago, a noted Russian commentator stated categorically that if Russia was going to be a global power, it first needed to be a regional hegemon within the post-Soviet space. And Putin has never quite articulated it this way, but I think it's clear that this is really what he's thinking. If Russia is going to be a pole in this new multipolar world that he keeps and Primakov keep talking about, then how is Russia going to demonstrate its strength? I don't think that Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. I honestly, this is, if anything, it's a right-wing kind of authoritarian regime. This is not communism, but he certainly has been talking about creating a Eurasian Union, which as of the moment consists of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia. And the other states that are lining up to join the Eurasian Union are Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia. Now note that the last three, and I would put Belarus in this category, really don't have very strong economies. So the question becomes, can Russia afford to support this whole new edifice that it seems to be trying to create? And there's lots of speculation, even in the Russian press, about whether this whole customs union, Eurasian Union, whatever term you want to use for it, really means anything at all without Ukraine. And I think that's one of the reasons that Ukraine has been proven to be so vital and so important to the Russians. I don't want to go over some of the stuff that's already been discussed, but I think that in terms of Putin's worldview, there are really two interrelated themes here. The first is, in his view, that the West wants a weak Russia. The West doesn't want competition from Russia. Some of the people around Putin even talk about the proposed economic reforms of the 1990s proposed by Jeff Sachs and others were designed to weaken Russia, not to strengthen Russia, not to help the transition from communism to capitalism. A second piece of this view is that the United States goes around promoting regime change. And who are the targets of this regime change? It is countries that have been friendly to or aligned with Russia. They blame us, or Putin blames us, for the so-called colored revolutions, Georgia, Ukraine in 2004, Kyrgyzstan in 2005, and I think Putin would add to this list Syria and Libya. So there's a Middle East component in terms of his worldview. I think the last thing that he's terrified of, and several people alluded to this, is what I call the fear of people power. The Arab Spring basically terrified the Russians, terrified Putin particularly because it was people taking to the streets to overthrow governments and to overthrow authoritarian governments. And of course, we saw this just a couple of weeks ago in downtown Kiev. I'm trying to skip so we can leave some time for questions here. What seems to be specifically Putin's strategy? I think Eugene made a very good point that this may not be a Russian strategy, but this is very clearly something that Putin himself is undertaking. There are two pieces. Obviously, the movement of men and materiel first into Crimea off the bases, the Black Sea Fleet base already in. That was already there, moving men out to the streets. We haven't talked a lot about the military movements, but we could talk about that. And the non-insigniaed Russian soldiers, or somebody said the non-Russian Russian soldiers. I think the second piece of this strategy has been the propaganda. Even prior to the whole eruption of the crisis in Ukraine, we saw Putin moving successively to crack down on the media, and just yesterday they denied internet access to several very liberal websites that were critical of the of the US government too, but of the Russian government. I think that the use of this fascism, that there are fascists who are in power in Kiev and we need to protect Russian citizens, I think part of that, the reason it's playing so well at home, it may not be playing well in Crimea, but it's certainly playing well within Russia, is that it has echoes of World War II, the Great Patriotic War. We're fighting the Nazis all over again, and therefore you should support what we're doing. And I think the second part of this is to further diminish Ukrainians in the eyes of the Russians, because after all, there were some Ukrainians who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II in order to throw off the communist yoke. So it leaves us with two questions. What exactly does Russia want in Crimea, and will it stop with Crimea? And these are my guesses. I don't think we have answers to either of these. I think most of the signs seem to point to some kind of annexation of Crimea, but I'm not sure that it's a done deal. I'm not sure that when the referendum occurs on Sunday, even though the Duma has already voted to accept new members of the Russian Federation, I'm not sure that that's exactly what would happen, because I think that there are risks in either having a kind of Ossetia or Abkhazia situation, or non-recognized independent state, and or something that's formally part of the Russian Federation. I think, as Gene alluded to, there are other states that have secessionist territories, other states that have ethnic minorities that may want to follow suit and follow the Crimean principle, if you will. I think you have to look at the equivocation of China. The Chinese reaction has been really interesting to watch. On the one hand, they've sort of said nothing to upset the Russians, and on the other hand, they're watching very warily because of Tibet, Xinjiang, even Taiwan. I also think that there's a downside for the other post-Soviet states. As was mentioned, Kazakhstan has a large Russian population that is contiguous to the Kazakh-Russian border. Is this a sign of the future? Should these other states be wary? Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, has already been talking about slowing down the processes of integration within the Eurasian Union, and has made several very open statements about it. Now, will Russia go beyond the Crimea? I'm willing to bet no, but given that there are troops now on the Ukrainian-Russian border, I don't know for sure. We don't know what the extent of those troop movements are, whether they're there to basically threaten Kiev. Like, if you move troops into Crimea, then we'll move into eastern Ukraine. Even the acting president has said, no, we're not going to move troops. The Ukrainian president said, we're not going to move troops into Crimea because we need to protect these other borders with Russia. We just don't know. The events in Donetsk, I think, bear watching, because two people, we don't know exactly whether it was one person or two people, were killed yesterday. Many more were injured. Apparently, the deaths were at the hands of pro-Russian thugs, I would have to call them. But is that going to be a pretext? Russia's already claiming today, well, see, it shows that the government in Kiev cannot control and cannot protect its citizens, and therefore, and of course the troops are already sitting there. I think that even if the Russian gambit and somehow Crimea is detached from Ukraine, I think that it's very costly to Russia in the long term. Some Republican quip that they're playing chess and we're playing marbles. I think the difference is not the game that we're playing, but I think the differences are short-term versus long-term time horizons. The Russians are playing a very short-term game. This is what I'm saying today. I'm making a grab for Crimea. I think any leveling of sanctions or anything else that we can impose on the Russians is a much longer-term cost. Of course, first of all, it's going to depend on how strongly the Europeans jump on board with us. Putin declared a year ago that he wanted Russian elites to divest themselves of assets held in the West, but many of them still have assets in the West. I was in Nice last summer, and every other real estate sign is in Russian. It's not in French. So people do stand to lose if the sanctions really take hold. There's concern about if Western banks if the governments pursue sanctions as they have against Iran, and Russian companies and Russian individuals are not allowed to use Western banks, this eventually, while it's costly to us, will eventually be costly to Russian business and to the Russian oligarchs. It's also been mooted that somehow we should get our newly found natural gas to Ukraine and to the other West European states in order to reduce the dependence on Russian gas. This clearly cannot happen overnight, but it's something that would be a longer-term strategy, which would deny Russia one more leverage, one more tool in its arsenal in terms of fighting with these countries. Somebody mentioned the G8 meeting. We're not planning the G8 meeting. I can't see that we're going to go to the G8 meeting. I don't see the other G7 going to the G8 meeting in Sochi. There was a time when I would have argued that Putin really cared about this. I'm not sure that he does now. There was a time when people talked about Putin wanting to be, belonging to all these Western clubs. I'm not sure that he really cares, that bridge has been burned. I think further economic isolation for the Russian will cost the Russian economy many billions of dollars. Capital flight in 2013 alone was $62.7 billion, and it has sped up since the crisis began. In the last couple of weeks, the stock market has tumbled 13.6%, and the value of the two state banks has fallen between 23 and 24%. So that there are economic costs, even from just fear about what the crisis is going to bring, that is already costing the Russian economy billions of dollars. The other thing is that there were several IPOs that were about to be listed both this week and next week, and they're now all on hold because who, after all, is going to buy shares in these companies when Russia may be sanctioned, may be isolated from the West? Gene, I think, referred to the rise of Russian nationalism. I think this is a real issue. Putin has been trying to use Russian nationalism. That, after all, is the push to protect, quote, Russian citizens or Russian language speakers, and there is a difference, and we need to make clear that there's a difference between the two. But within the Russian Federation itself, there are over 100 different nationality groups that are duly recognized. If you begin in your rhetoric to privilege Russian language speakers, what does that mean for the other groups within Russia itself? I already mentioned that I think that it's frightening the other states that are kind of within Russia's orbit, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, talking about needing a legal settlement, supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I mean, these are major statements from states that are supposedly lining to join with Russia in the Eurasian Union. Let's see. Finally, let me conclude by asking if there's a way out of the crisis. A lot of different people, including Mike McFaul, who's the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, who is a colleague of all of ours, have mooted a plan that would include making the new government in Kiev more inclusive, including representatives from all the regions, creating within Ukraine some form of wider autonomy or confederalism, excuse me, protection for Russian speakers. Gene, just pass me the water. Thank you. Sorry. Somebody else proposed a moratorium on Ukraine joining any international organizations for 5 years, sort of while it gets its own act together. A return of Russian troops to the barracks. I apologize. That Russia should recognize a new government in Kiev and the legitimacy of the May 25th elections. Obviously, this would require tremendous concessions from all sides, and I think one of the issues could be sequencing, even if this is accepted. One of the last points I would make, and I think that this is really important, is that there have been several reports, both in the Russian press, at least until yesterday, and in the Russian press and in the Western press, about who's actually making the decisions in Moscow. And it seems that it's a very small group of former KGB types, buddies of Putin's, and he's excluded the foreign ministry and the finance ministry, etc. So that even if we level sanctions and even if the oligarchs begin to hurt, do they have any voice in this decision-making process in the Kremlin? The only formal Russian official to speak out was Alexei Kudrin yesterday, who gave a speech in St. Petersburg in which he condemned the Russian policy and said, you're going to kill the Russian economy. So I think the time frame issue is a very big one, and I'm sorry I'm losing my voice, so I think I'll stop there.
Well, despite my vast experience chairing panels, I've utterly mismanaged the time management aspect of all this. So in the interest of giving you a chance to ask some questions, I'm going to just pass on making any remarks myself. I would say one thing, and it's a slightly critical word. I think one can look at this crisis from two perspectives. One perspective is the perspective that has guided the United States foreign policy since the Cold War ended. This is a perspective that's really based on the underlying sort of way that the Cold War ended, which is basically as a kind of victory for the liberal West. And I think people on our side perceived a permanent victory for liberal principles. And that these kinds of liberal principles can and or should transcend more classical notions of national interest. And I do think that somewhat under-discussed in this panel is a kind of conceptualization of Russian national interest that might give us a little bit more perspective on what the Russians are up to. And I'm not going to try and do that here, but I do think that in all of this, there are two things going on. There's an overarching narrative of a liberal nature. It's about democracy and rights, and Putin is a reactionary. And then there's another way of looking at this, which is the strategic interaction between a very great power of the United States and its pretty rich and prosperous allies, and a power that suffered tremendous decline and has been trying to pull itself back up in a kind of international hierarchy, and has only had a little luck doing it. And after considerable effort and energy, I think that power saw whatever progress it was making in grave jeopardy. And I think this helps explain a little bit about why the Russians acted, and may provide a little guidance for what kind of settlement might be able to find. But I don't want to go on any longer. Many of you have been here patiently. We'll push the limit of this thing just a little longer, but the room is needed by 2 o'clock. So we have to, if we go a little over, when I say we're done, everybody has to evacuate the premises so that the next people inherit it intact. So I'm going to take the questions, right? And I'm going to go around here. And by the way, you should all understand I'm completely undemocratic. Keep your hands up because I don't know your name. So I'm going to start with you. Yeah, I'm pointing. It's all I can do. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alex Proton. I was born in Kiev, so this is sort of near and dear to me. I grew up in San Francisco. 2 questions. First, the role of China in all of this. On one hand, China is a vast energy market. It requires a lot of energy. So when we're talking about having the U.S. send natural gas to Europe, if Russia stops supplying this natural gas to Europe, will it still have a market to sell this gas? That's where most of Russia's funding comes from anyways, oil and gas. So that's my first question. My second question, no one has touched on the fact that during this whole revolution, from November to now, we've been talking about it all because internet has not been shut off, phone lines have not been shut off in Ukraine, and so the access to communications has been open. If we can draw a parallel to Venezuela, for example, where things have been shut, the communications have been shut off in many cases. And so can you just comment on that aspect?
Let me take one or 2 others, and then we can get on. This gentleman here in the white jacket. Yeah.
Regime change is a very important point that you brought up. The United States supported.
By the way, I want questions, not speeches, just so everyone knows. Questions, not speeches. Please proceed.
Okay, so the United States supported the coup against the democratically elected government of Ukraine by an opposition. Was neo-Nazi. The United States supported the coup against the democratically elected government of Egypt by a fascist general. The United States supported the coup against the democratically elected government of Honduras. And we could go back through many other situations, going back through Chile, Vietnam, etc. Why does the United States support government by coup?
A very general question. This gentleman here in the back with his hand up, the one who's standing. I'm forgetting your name, I'm sorry. I know we're, yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I'm somewhat sympathetic to what I think was behind that last question. I just want to make a brief comment. As an American, I'm concerned about what my government may do and how my government responds. And I think perhaps, and I'm using this as a sort of instructive observation, the U.S. government might set an example by offering to relinquish Guantanamo. That might make it easier for Russia to respond to the sense of threat about a naval installation in Crimea. I have questions about,
why don't you just ask one?
Yeah, well, it's one question. It's people talked about perceptions and what's Russian perceptions and what's in Putin's head. I would like to hear people talk about in as factual a way as possible, how you understand the expansion of NATO. Is it, as Stephen Walt said, important in a C-SPAN discussion of Ukraine the other night. Is it important to not have Ukraine be seen to be being promoted as a bulwark against Russia in order for there to be some compromise in this situation? And is the new government in Ukraine a government about which there should be some skepticism in terms of its composition, in terms of right-wing and anti-Semitic
Okay, I think we have it
elements?
now. Okay, thanks. I'll take one more, so those people who had hands up. Oh, sorry, yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Considering if this ends more or less more amicably, the crisis, when will they start talking about the leadership vacuum in Kiev? Too many old leaders that are tainted and nobody who's new and fresh and experienced.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have 4 good questions, and I'm going to turn the panel loose on it. Everybody doesn't have to answer every question. We'll just go down from left. Well, actually, Carol, we'll give you voice a little longer to rest. How about that? So you can wait. So we'll start with Oxana, and then we'll go the other way. Yeah. Oh, you want to answer anyway, despite your voice. Okay, go ahead. No, please. No, I was going to give you a chance to rest your voice for a minute. Please, go ahead.
Let me answer the question about energy because I think it's important. As of now, most of Russia's natural gas and oil exports go west to Europe, both to the former Soviet bloc states in Eastern Europe and to Western Europe. One of the issues has been, what can you sanction? That would be the most potent sanction, but people are worried that Germany gets a third of its, natural gas from Russia. It's not so easy to reverse the spigot, in a sense, to suddenly have everything get exported the other way. The pipelines do not yet exist. Russia and China have been negotiating for years over the price of price of oil, rather. China had to actually fund the building of the pipeline, so they're really in the driver's seat in terms of prices and everything else as far as that goes. It's not as easy or as simple that Russia's not going to lose anything. I mean, Putin's been talking a good game for a while, but I don't think it's as simple as all of that. I also think that Russia will lose ultimately because they have not kept up with the changes in extractive technologies, that once the U.S. does begin exporting liquefied natural gas and the infrastructure exists, which it does not now, all that gas that was going to Europe, first of all, the price will be lower. Second of all, they'll have alternative sources. And Russia, which depends on this income, will not have as much as it has now. So I think that it's a long-term detrimental trend for the Russians. Let me just also talk about the NATO expansion issue. I argued against NATO expansion in the 90s, and especially the second round that included the Baltic states. So in a sense, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that argument, but that's also, we have to be careful that we use that as perhaps an explanation for part of Putin's worldview, but not excuse this seizure of power and use of military force to take Crimea. They're two very different questions, and while I may be sympathetic to that worldview, and I think it definitely did fuel some of Putin's concern, I think we have to be really careful.
Oxana, is there anyone easy you want to pick up?
Let me pick very briefly on 3 points that relate, I think, to domestic scene in Ukraine. Very briefly to add on the NATO, and then also on the so-called coup, right, to what extent what happened actually could be characterized as a coup, and then the far right. So on the NATO, I agree with Carol. I don't think it's a good idea for Ukraine, but we should keep in mind, right, when Russia say like it's concerned about NATO, we can say it's a legitimate concern. Ukrainian government didn't say anything about joining NATO, right? There is actually in the Ukrainian law now, which was introduced during Yanukovych, that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. New government didn't say anything about joining NATO. The EU is a different matter, right? It has much greater support within Ukraine, according to most recent poll. In a hypothetical referendum on the EU accession, 63% would support it. Support for NATO is less than 30%, probably around 20%, right? So I think we should keep the two in mind, right? I also think NATO expansion into Ukraine wouldn't be a good idea, not only because Russia wouldn't like it, but because Ukrainians themselves don't want it. Now, on the coup question, question, right? I'm not going to say anything about Honduras because I don't know about Honduras, but the fact that Yanukovych was elected legitimately doesn't mean that everything he had done since is necessarily legitimate. He, for example, single-handedly essentially changed the constitution in 2010 to increase his power, so he was elected with smaller powers and he subsequently grabbed for himself. Now, also when he was ousted, it's not that like the swastika-wielding Nazis chased him out, he skipped town, he literally fled. Right? So again, and once he fled, Ukrainian constitution, and that's, by the way, the case for many other constitutions, does not have a provision. It simply does not have a provision what to do when the president disappears. There are provisions when the president commits treason or dies or falls sick, but when the president simply skips town, there is no provision, by the way. And then Ukraine is not an exception. So imagine sort of hypothetical scenario, any leader who kind of gets weakened and might lose election can just skip town and condemn the next government to illegitimacy in a number of European countries, right? So what Ukrainian government did by passing, the parliament did, which was legitimately elected too, by the way, by passing a resolution relieving him of his duty, was certainly extra-constitutional, but it wasn't anti-constitutional because constitution didn't have anything to say about that. So I'll leave it at that, right? And then finally, on the far right, right? I think it is true that the far right has certain positions in the government, although I'm still kind of puzzled why Western media keeps repeating that Jarosz, the leader of the right sector, is deputy head of the Security and Defense Council. He is not. He was offered this position, he declined, he was never appointed. You can check on presidential website, there is no decree appointing him. So the people who now, for example, the head of the self-defense, who is now the chairman of the National Security and Defense Council, first of all, they're more moderate people. They haven't really done anything sort of radical to be, yet. But we can say that, yes, there is some disproportionate influence in the current government. But two things to keep in mind. First of all, it's meant to be temporary caretaker government. Second of all, it reflects the current composition of the Ukrainian parliament, where Svoboda does have some parliamentary seats. Third of all, some parties, including the UDAR, the Boxer party, said they don't want to participate in this government because they want new election. And Party of Regions said it wants to be in the opposition, right? So in general, the idea of inclusivity is good, and the government actually have done certain steps, for example, appointing governors in the East who are from the East, who have some sort of respect and authority in the East, right? So more can be done, but the idea that sort of the government is dominated by this crazy far right, I think it's an overstatement, right? So that's what, and as I said, the support in the polls is quite low. So if there are fresh elections, the far right is not going to command that much influence. So I'll leave it at that.
John, do you want to pick up on any of this?
I would just refer to the question about leadership vacuum in Kyiv. I think the question was right, that in fact we're seeing all the old leaders come out of the woodwork, including in the opposition. The one exception to that, of course, is Mr. Klitschko, who's not an old leader, who's a new leader. He disappointed some people on the Maidan by a willingness to compromise, but that's an understandable willingness. What I consider to be the intelligent move by the opposition in facing off the Russian danger of appointing oligarchs in the East has the disadvantage of strengthening their position. They are very much part of the old leadership and the old problem of Ukraine. All I can say is we'll wait for the elections in May and see who comes into power. But it is true that the enthusiasm in the streets of Kyiv and elsewhere, which drove out Yanukovych, would be a check on the old power, whether from the opposition or the previous government parties, reasserting itself. The fact they had to deal with the Russian crisis diverts their attention, and that's unfortunate in terms of the business of internal politics in Ukraine, but not much can be done about that at the present time. Just one more point on the coup question. Let's not forget that the man who's no longer president of Ukraine oversaw, if he did not order the firing on his own citizens. We drove out of office a presidentially, someone who was elected in a fair election, Mr. Nixon, for something far less problematic than having snipers open up on American citizens.
Don't forget, that's not proven. That's not proven.
All right.
Please, 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 please. Hey, I'm asking you, I'm asking, please. Well, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking the speakers, and I would thank you all for coming out.